to this edition of our podcast, Disrupting the Dominoes. That's Disrupting the Dominoes of Violence. I'm Arlene Lemus, the CEO of PAVE Prevention, and I'm super excited about our guest today. The list is long in accomplishments and the work that he's doing, but I'm going to try to keep it or else this episode will be too long. So we're going to keep it short. Our next guest is a veteran, an advocate, a speaker, an author, a poet. And the description that I found that I love about our guest is an unapologetic spoken word artist. So super excited to have Edward Wilson, also known as Obbie West, as our guest. Edward, welcome. I'm so excited to have you, and thank you so much for joining us on our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm going to jump kind of right into this.
Okay.
And if you don't mind sharing with our listeners and our viewers, tell us about what was your path getting to where you're at today, and what are you working on today?
What was my path? That's a great question. And I'm gonna try to keep that path, because that path got forks, right? So I'm gonna try to keep that path on one of those roads, because those forks will extend this about 40 years. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, right? I grew up in a very challenging, violent neighborhood, and I grew up in an abusive household. So growing up, because of my surroundings, it gave me an opportunity to witness abuse, witness violence, see how it affected people. And as a result of that, I developed an absolute disdain for violence. Fast forward, I joined the military at 17. After I was in the military for about 10, 11 years, I learned about poetry. So I didn't even know about poetry all these years. I thought it was just roses are red, violets are blue. That was the extent of my relationship with poetry. And then I went to a venue that was advertised as a comedy show. But when I went there were poets, and just the level of liberation that they had in expressing what it is that they came with. It felt like my path. It felt like this is the thing I should be doing. So when I started writing poetry, I would never sit down and predetermine a topic. I would just write about whatever resonated with me. So if it was something as minuscule as the irritating lady inside of the self-checkout machine at Walmart, the one that says, please put your item in the baggage. If it was something as minuscule as that, I would write about it if it resonated. So after about a year of looking back over my catalog, it was a lot of abuse reduction type topics. So someone introduced me to a way that I could use that body of work in order to address that topic in a more formal capacity, like education, training, things of that nature. So in a medium-sized nutshell, that's how it happened. It started from childhood and then catapulted into me using an art form to address my disdain for abuse.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that path took you in that direction, because you're doing some incredibly powerful stuff. So I'll share a little bit. I know that we had some conversations on the phone, but I think our paths parallel lines, because I think the way you view a violence prevention for the military is much like I view violence prevention before PAVE in the sporting world, in the elite sporting world, where you have these incredible power dynamics, where you have people who hold all the keys to the castle, and athletes' dreams in front of them, or soldiers' dreams in front of them, of a life of promotions and moving up through the ranks. And then you have people who hold those keys in abusive and predatory positions and predatory behavior. So that's how I came at it. And now I've added to the hats that I wear. And my goal is to come at violence prevention from reducing violence in the workplace. For you, that's reducing. I know your efforts go towards reducing violence in the military, and sexual harassment and sexual assaults within the military and that workplace, which I find fascinating. And I think much like what happens in the sporting world changes society on a whole, I believe that what happens in the military also impacts society on a whole, because people leave the military and then the skills they have ripple as they move on to everyday life. So I think it's very powerful what you're doing. So if you could just share a little bit on, what is SHARP, and, share with our listeners and our viewers on what that is and what work you're doing there.
Okay, well, SHARP, on the surface level, just the acronym itself, it stands for Sexual Assault and Harassment Response Prevention. So what SHARP is, it's the SAPR program. The Air Force recognizes SAPR program, which is Sexual Assault Prevention Response. And then you have SHARP in the Army. So different components of the military have different names, but we all have a common goal. So what it is, it's just it's a program to bring awareness to what abuse looks like, to implement the preventive measures so that we don't have to deal with abuse, and any events that abuse recurs, how do we respond to it? So it tries to attack it from every angle. Well, let's try to prevent it first. If we can't prevent it, or it's not prevented, then how do we respond to it on the back end? And I think it's a very, very important program, because a lot of behavior within society has been normalized. And because of the normalization of a lot of this behavior, there's a lot of people who don't recognize it as being what it is, right? I'm a firm believer that there's ignorance, and then there's blatant perpetrators. If I'm a person and I know what right or wrong is, but I still want to act in a way that satisfies my desires, even though that way is abusive, right? I'm a perpetrator. But if I'm a person who I've lived in an environment where certain behavior was normalized, say for instance, I was texting a young lady and she and I have agreed to have sex, right? We've been texting for about 2 weeks, and we've agreed, we've planned it, we've talked about it, we've fetishized it, we've done all these things. And then when I meet up with her, in my mind, I've already received consent. So if after we meet up, she starts drinking, and then I move forward after she starts drinking, I'm moving forward out of ignorance, because I think my consent over the text messages still hold firm, right? But the awareness tells me that needs to be revisited all the way up into the second that the engagement occurs. So now you have somebody who has offended someone out of ignorance. So I think if we can bring awareness to the point where we minimize the cases that come from ignorance, now all we have to deal with is the blatant perpetrators, and that number is probably a little smaller. So that's what the SHARP program does, is we're not just targeting people who have the intent to do wrong, but we also want to bring awareness to people who don't know that your behavior may be predatory, even if you're not trying to make it, even if that's not your intent.
Yeah, you're spot on. You're spot on. And I think a lot of in my world, our programming at Paid Prevention comes from years, 30, 40 years of work in what was called the empowerment self-defense movement. And it was really came out of female martial artists, feminist female martial artists, who tried to tailor some programming towards women. And I think we have finally finally moved to an area where men have to be at the table. It can't just be women, and it can't just be gender-based violence centered. It has to be everyone at the table having these discussions. And so we started finding, like, I'll give an example of a program that a good friend of mine runs nationwide now, but started in the DC area, called Safe Bars. And it was training professionals in the service industry to identify predatory behavior, or have, they even come up with a code word now. Hey, is Angela working today? And that tells the bartender that, hey, something's going on. This person is being harassed, or something's quite not right. But anyway, so they have this training for Safe Bars. And then guess what? The bartender goes, oh, shoot, I'm that guy sometimes. I'm the guy that says something off cuff, completely like you're saying, unintended, out of ignorance. But that's why we have to have everybody at the table when we're having these discussions, to give people a chance to learn and be better. So I think the approach of what SHARP is doing, I think, is very powerful. So let me ask you another question. I know that I have read things and heard you in speaking engagements where you say things like, you use the term a perp toolbox.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can you share with me what that means? What is a perpetrator's toolbox, and why is it important that we start looking at it from that way?
Perpetrator's toolbox is, as society, we have these stigmas, these beliefs that we perpetuate throughout society that indirectly and sometimes directly paves the way for abuse, right? So if I'm a perpetrator and I hear, there was a documentary I was watching about a young lady who was in college who was sexually assaulted during the time that she was inebriated. She drank herself. She drank and she drank and she drank until she was incoherent. So people noticed that she was incoherent and they took advantage of her and they assaulted her. So during the documentary, the interviewer interviewed two of her friends who were women as well. They asked her friends, "How do you feel about what happened to your friend?" And her two female friends responded, "Well, she should have been more responsible for her actions. She got herself drunk beyond the point of control," right? If I'm a perpetrator, I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna put it in my toolbox. If I hear somebody say, "Well, what do you expect? The person was over there after 1 a.m." My grandmother used to tell her daughters, "Hey, listen, don't go nowhere after 1 a.m. The only thing over there open after 1 a.m. is legs." If I'm a perpetrator, I'm gonna take that and put it in my toolbox. If I hear somebody say a man can't be assaulted, I mean, you can't rape the willing. You know what I mean? If I hear somebody say that and I'm a
Yeah.
perpetrator, I'm gonna put that in my toolbox. So now, if I happen to get caught, first of all, when I target someone, I'm gonna target someone who falls under those criteria. Society says if you're wearing that, that means you want this type of attention. So I'm gonna target you. Society says if you come over after 1 a.m., then that means that you want this type of attention. So I'm gonna invite you over after this time. I'm gonna try to plan my attack based on the stigmas that I know society has approved. So now when I'm standing in court and there's a jury of 12 people who was walking down the street, somebody picked them up by the head and dropped them in a jury box and said, "This is your job for the next month." They're microcosms of society. A lot of
Yep.
times they've been conditioned with those same ill mentalities that everybody else has. So now when I say I was just unsure because she came over, it was 2 a.m. I didn't know. And then when she came over, she was wearing this. So I had no clue. That jury box or society is the one that put that in my toolbox. So it's likely somebody's going to side with me and I'm going to end up walking. So as society, the things we say, perpetrators use those things and they put those things in their toolbox. And then this is the tools that they use in order to dismantle people later on. And then they throw those same things we said back up in our face when it's time for us to judge them. And then we side with them and they leave. So it's the concept of, if you have a child and your child is school age and your child is in a bathroom and a bully says, "Hey, I'm gonna go beat the crap out of this child. Hey, I need you to go watch the door while I beat the crap out of this child." So someone watches the door. The bully goes in there and beats this child. As the parent, you're just as upset as with the person who held the door as you is with the person who beat your child. So a
Yep.
lot of times we have to make sure we're not holding the door. And whenever we're perpetuating all these sayings and filling those toolboxes, we're pretty much holding the door. So we're just as we're accomplice and
Right.
don't realize that we're being that
Yeah, great. And that's a great description of it. And I'm glad that our listeners and our viewers are able to hear you express that, because I think it's really powerful. You know, I believe I grew up in inner city Chicago. I grew up in one of the, at the times, now it's a little bougie, but when I grew up in the neighborhood of Humboldt Park, it was a pretty rough neighborhood here. And there was a lot of gang violence. And there was a lot of, I mean, fire department didn't want to show up there when there was a fire, and police department took their time on certain calls. And so I grew up around violence as well, and I believe strongly that violence impacts us every day. The ripple effects of violence, the dominoes that continue to fall because of violent events, is robbing us. It's robbing us of being the best parent we can be, the best daughter we can be, the best boss, the best employee, the best coach. So I really feel, especially in light of the pandemic, that now is the time that we can make some change at work. And we present it in a way, which I'm sure you'll agree with me, because of your work with the military, that because of the impact violence is having on us, it's increasing turnover. It's increasing our training budget. It's reducing productivity and creating work environments that aren't as productive as they should be. And I think the approach that PAVE takes is much different. Much like you feel, and I've heard you say, that the training cannot be check the box training. It can't be something mandatory. It has to be necessary. And we have to change that. I mean, your use of words is so powerful. So if you can just talk about that, two things I heard you say. You said it has to move from mandatory to necessary. And that when you discuss this with about soldiers, you say it is a quality of life issue for soldiers, this type of training and this acknowledgement of what's happening. So please share some thoughts on that and why you use those words.
I'm in the military, and even if we take it out of the realm of the military and we talk about any organization, there are mandatory requirements, right? Even in corporate America, there's a mandatory requirement that you talk about certain things annually. And a lot of times those requirements are put in place as a protective measure for the organization, right? So if, say, for instance, you're in corporate America and you say something inappropriate and there's a sexual harassment complaint, as the organization, I can say, hey, I told him he had the training. Here's a certificate that he printed out after he checked all those little slides. So it's not because we didn't tell him he was supposed to do it. So it kind of removes the organization out of the blame line, right? So these things are made mandatory for those reasons a lot of times. So with the military, there's a regulation. The regulation says these are all your mandatory trainings, and it tells you how you can measure the training. So if I have a mandatory requirement to take a physical fitness test, it tells me the physical fitness test are these events. If you run this fast, this is your score. If you do this many push-ups, this is your score. So everything is measurable by a score. When it says that you have to talk about sexual assault and harassment, that is measurable by the amount of time you talk about it. In order for you to qualify and meet this training requirement, you have to talk about it 4 hours within this time frame, right? You can't measure effectiveness by the time frame I talked about it. If another organization talked about it for, if it's the PT test and I run faster than you, I get a higher score. I'm more efficient than you in that event. Yep. But if your organization talks about this topic for 30 minutes and I talk about it for 31 minutes, does that mean that my training was more impactful than theirs? It doesn't. So you can't measure it by time. So it's a personal responsibility of the individuals who are in charge of that program to make sure that they put measures in place to ensure that this thing is measurable by its actual effectiveness, right? Whenever you're training somebody to shoot a weapon, to run fast, you're training to enhance a skill. Whenever you're talking about sexual assault and harassment prevention, you're changing a person. So those things can't be trained the same. They have to be trained with a different level of focus. One is a lifestyle adjustment. One is just enhancing a skill. So with that lifestyle adjustment, it can't be just limited to whatever those hours of training are. It has to be something that's addressed and implemented throughout the course of the day, the month, the year, the week, yep. Whenever we see something that needs to be addressed. So I think it's very important that we look at we don't look at it the same way we look at training a skill. Because if we do, it'll end up being just a check the block. A big part of this is reapplying lost definitions, right? There's a lot of instances where, like jaywalking, when I was a kid, there was a term called jaywalking, which means it was illegal to walk across the street outside of the crosswalk or if you're not at the light, right? But if I'm somewhere in New York and I'm just constantly crossing the street outside of the crosswalk, police officers see me and they don't say anything, it's no longer called jaywalking. Now it's just called crossing the street. It's lost its definition because it's not being enforced. So this is what happens in cases where you have somebody who goes to the copy machine, and somebody says something inappropriate, and then somebody says, hey, do you hear what such and such said to you? Oh, that's just men will be men. That's just women will be women. It's so common and so unchecked that it's lost its definition of being harassment. Now it's just known as men will be men, woman will be woman. So we have to reapply those definitions the second we see it. Hey, you know, that's absolutely wrong. What you just said to this person constitutes harassment. This is what you could happen. At that point, we've just reapplied a lost definition. Now this person can't play ignorant anymore. So that's the lifestyle that I'm talking about. As it happens, it needs to be addressed. And that's more than just training.
Yeah, I mean, I've shared on this podcast before, but I'll share it with you and I'll share it again for our listeners and our viewers. There was some 350 physicians had gone through an online training module for de-escalation. And they went through these physicians went through this online module of training, which I will say is check the box training. It's not meaningful training. It's just to check a box, much like you're discussing. And they went back in 6 months and interviewed the physicians that took this training. 75% of them didn't even remember taking the module. So there was no retention. The skills weren't there. There was nothing really imparted. And that's what's happening, especially in the healthcare sector. There are millions of dollars being thrown at this check the box training, like you just described, with no real circle back to say what's working, what's not working.
Absolutely.
And that's where we look to change at PAVE. And I know that that's what your vision is for what's happening in the military, is to circle back and say what's working, what's not working. Come on, guys, let's really look at this. Not just say we imparted some training or we offered this to our employees without a real circle back on what's working. At PAVE, we're creating an assessment tool for an organization to be able to identify workplace aggression and indicators for workplace violence. And we'll be able to put a real figure on that, a real number on that, and then customize our training accordingly to help improve those numbers. So I think your acknowledgement that, we're just doing mandatory training instead of necessary training is very powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about this book, The Blossom. I think it's called Blossom.
Blossom. Yeah.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Well, I'll tell you about the initial motivation for Blossom. It's going to seem extremely trivial. My daughter was 15 when she wrote her first book, and I was envious. It was like, how she got a book and I don't have one? So I just wrote Blossom because she had a book. So what Blossom is, it's an organized effort of poems that just address life in general. So you may hear about love. You may hear about the bad sides of love. You may hear about just how social media has now taken the place of mailboxes. Those little blue mailboxes that sit on corners are null and void because we're not mailing letters anymore. Now we're just anything that felt relevant to me at the time. And it was my first book. It's very transparent. It talks about my woes with marriage. When I was married, I transitioned from a boy to a man within this relationship, made a whole bunch of mistakes that ultimately ended up ruining the relationship. It addresses that. So it's just a very, very vulnerable and honest body of work that came from what I may have been dealing with, or what was most relevant to me during that time frame. All motivated by envy, because I was jealous of my daughter for having a book. But that's what it turned out to be.
Well, it sounds like you've done a good job empowering your daughter to pursue those type of goals. So good for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I just have a couple more questions for you, and this has been great. I've really enjoyed this. I saw also on a quote from you on one of your presentations that you were focusing on how males have a hard time coming forward and reporting, and you were going to have a discussion on why we need to discuss this and why it is a barrier for men to come forward. If you'd like to share something on that for our listeners.
Yeah, and this can be extremely long. I'll try to make it.
No, take your time. Take your time. Love to hear it.
And on the foundation, as men, we have been conditioned, right? We have been conditioned not to come forward. If you look at any organization where it requires an initiation process for men, right? Look at colleges, and in colleges they have fraternities that have an initiation process. You look at any organization that has an initiation, that initiation process involves abuse. And the quickest way to get put out of that organization is to admit or not be able to handle the abuse. Right? Me and my sister, hypothetically, if me and my sister grew up in a household where we weren't allowed to express ourselves. And whenever we did express ourselves, we were belittled or berated or came down on. So eventually we just stopped being expressive. We just kept it to ourselves. So now we grow and we're adults. She's in her household and she's not expressive. She keeps things in herself, to herself. I'm in my household and I'm not expressive with my significant other. I keep things to myself. For me, they're going to call it toxic masculinity. What do you call it for her? Trauma response.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
Whenever you diagnose something as a trauma response, we have remedies to fix that. So now we try to figure out how can we help. According to the world, there's no cure for toxic masculinity. So whenever you automatically diagnose that to me, what do you do when you have something that has no cure? You send them home to die. So whenever you automatically diagnose me with toxic masculinity, even though my condition spawned from the same place as this woman's, now you're not going to do anything to help me. You're just going to hold it against me and send me home to die. So men are automatically diagnosed without digging into what their problems are. And when we're automatically diagnosed with this thing, it creates a problem. And then the definition of masculinity throughout society is to not be subject to pain, right? Not show emotions, not spread emotions. So now as men, when we feel a pressure to live up to society's definition of masculinity, now it's a hindrance whenever we have to come forward and say something was painful. Whenever I get a group of men in one room, I always pick one man. I say, hey, listen, you're sitting in a social setting, you're sitting there with a woman, right? And you order something to drink, you order some water, and they bring you a bottled water with a twist top, but the top's too tight. You can't twist it off. What are you gonna do? And they just stare at me. Now, I don't know. I've heard somebody say, I'll bite the bottom and drink the water. Somebody said, I just won't have any water to drink. Rarely does anybody ever say that they're gonna ask the woman next to them to see if she can open a bottle, because we're not going to put ourselves in a position for a woman to demonstrate a level of strength that we didn't have, because it makes us feel emasculated. So they're just going to go thirsty without water or bite the bottom of it before I ask this. So if something as minuscule as that makes a man feel emasculated, how emasculated is he going to feel if he has to come forward with a report?
Right.
So in life, we have, as men, we have been conditioned, and it's a dual responsibility. Eric, you spoke to Eric, right?
Yeah.
I remember Eric is a survivor of sexual abuse. And I remember there was a long time that Eric didn't speak about it. And when he finally decided to speak about it, the first place that he did his survivor's testimony was in Oklahoma at a place called Fort Sill. So I went to Fort Sill with him because I'm a part of that testimony. And him and I are in a hotel room and we're getting ready to leave to go so he can give his survivor's testimony. And I asked him, I said, hey, bro, what you gonna do if you get up there in front of those people and you feel like you're gonna cry? You get that little knot in your throat, you feel like you're gonna cry. He just sat there kind of in silence for a couple of seconds. So then I said, listen, I think you should just cry, push it out. Once you're done crying, finish your testimony, we can go home. Instantly, it's like his shoulders rose because the man next to him just gave him permission to show a level of sensitivity. So as men, we have to give other men permission to show innate levels of emotion and not make them feel like they have to barricade it in order to maintain their definition as a man. So it's a man's responsibility to other men. And then as women, if I'm sitting with a woman in a public place and somebody's drunk, says something crazy to her, like prime example, a friend of mine sent me a video the other day where it was a man and a woman walking. A group of men were coming towards them. The group of men walked in between them and then like grabbed the woman's arm. She pulled her arm and she just kept walking. And she sent that to me and she asked me, what would you do if that was you and your significant other? If that man doesn't do anything, if he doesn't act barbaric or respond to the four dudes who just disrespected them, oftentimes a woman will look at him like, you're not going to do nothing. And now he's forced to act barbaric because he know when I drive home with this woman, she's going to look at me as less than because I didn't go fight four dudes. So even as women can't put excessive pressure on men to act like animals in order to maintain their definition of it as a man. The best thing for that man to do in that situation is just him and a woman. Four dudes just did something inappropriate. Wasn't too damaging, but it was inappropriate. Is to check on his woman, see if she's okay, baby. Are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. And then they proceed. Because I can go act barbaric and then get a gun pulled on me and now I'm killed, but at least you can say your man stood up for you. You know what I mean?
Crazy.
So
Yeah.
it's,
No,
yeah,
I
so it's
get
a
it.
dual responsibility. So again, I can go on about that forever, but
Right.
to address your question, those are some of the things that I think contribute to the barriers of reporting for men. And even physiological um, ignorance, not understanding how that works. There was a period of time to where I was addicted to pornography, right? This is back when the VHSs, I know you and I know what VHS is. Younger
Yeah.
crowd, might, so for
Yep.
those who are watching, who are younger, who don't know what a VHS is, it's a rectangle, and you put it inside of another rectangle, and you press play, and it puts an image on a bigger square, right? This is how we used to watch TV. So back when VHS tapes was relevant, I would go rent these VHS tapes with pornography on it. And if you've ever seen a VHS tape with pornography, it has advertisements before the actual porn comes on, just like regular movies. And this thing had two men. This was back in like 98. It had a sexual encounter between two men. And I was just looking at it out of pure surprise that it was happening. It was something I had never seen, right? And my body responded. I got an erection from looking at these men and didn't understand why. For the next 2 weeks, I'm doing push-ups trying to reestablish my manhood. What I didn't understand is that naturally my body responds to intimacy, right? If one of those men make a sound that sounds like a woman, my body's going to respond to that sound. If two giraffes are having sex and one of them sounds like a woman, my body may respond to that sound. So now I have an erection that I don't understand. And men sometimes have erections while they're being assaulted, and that body betrayal tricks them into believing maybe I wasn't assaulted, and they don't say anything. So
Right.
even the physiological ignorance can be a barrier for reporting. So there's tons of them.
Right. Yeah. You know, everybody knows about Dr. Larry Nasser and, you know, everything, the horrible things that happened with our U.S. gymnasts and the hundreds of women that were impacted, women and girls that were impacted there. And it stresses me out that America doesn't know about what happened at Ohio State and what happened at Michigan with a doctor and wrestling teams and high school wrestling teams. And, you know, it just kind of flies under everybody's radar,
Right.
although they're very similar situations. And actually, what they say about those doctors is the victims are in the thousands, because it was, you know, like a 15, 16-year career of access to athletes at the college level, the high school level, at the campus clinic. And it just hurts my heart that as a society, the male athletes there just aren't as supported, I guess, for lack of a better term, or don't feel that they would be supported if they came forward, especially such a, you know, a macho sport like wrestling, to then have to, you know, come forward and say, this happened to me, this doctor did this to me, or this coach did this to me. It just, I hope I see in my lifetime a situation that's different and men can come forward in those situations and speak freely, because we know if 1,000 came forward, there's probably 5,000 out there. And that's what's really scary and really hurts my heart.
Yeah, if I can briefly address that, it's also embedded in the judicial system, like the definition of rape in North Carolina, the definition of first degree forcible rape and first degree forcible second degree in North Carolina is forceful vaginal penetration. The word vaginal is embedded in the definition, which implies if I'm a man, I can't be raped in that state.
Wow.
By definition, there's a lesser charge of sodomy, but when you define rape, the word vaginal is in there, right? There was an organization who printed a flyer, and the flyer, it was an advocacy office which has great people, probably was an oversight, but the flyer said, this can happen to your mother, this can happen to your auntie, this can happen to your niece, this could happen to your sister. It had everyone it could happen to, but they was all of one gender. So if I'm a man in that organization, my organization doesn't believe this is my problem. So if it happens, how likely am I to go forward?
Right.
You've already pretty much said indirectly in this flyer that it's only the problem of, so even if you look at help sources, a lot of help sources throughout the world is the Crisis Center for Women, the Help Center for Women and Children. The word woman is embedded in the title. So if I'm a man and this is what I'm seeing, then society says I don't have a problem. So I'm not going to be victimized twice by the person who victimized me and then again by the system because they don't believe this is my problem. So that's another barrier for men to come forward is society doesn't recognize it as a problem. And one last thing, remember I was sitting inside of a barbershop and my barber was cutting my hair. There was a bunch of male barbers. So I figured this is a perfect time to get a sample of society. So I asked my barber, I said, hey, what would you do, or what do you think would happen if you walked inside of a club and you saw a woman and you just grabbed her crotch area? He was like, oh man, she'll slap me and then they'll throw me out the club. He just talked about all the response that would come against him if he did that. I said, what if the tables were turned and she grabs yours? He was like, oh, it's on. He would accept it as a turn on, right? So now, if I'm a man, I have to recognize that whenever I do that, I'm speaking for my entire gender, right? So if a million men say that's, did I lose you?
No, still here.
Okay, your picture went away. If a million men say that, I see you now. If a million men say that that's a turn on, and I'm the millionth and first one who it happens to, and I don't like it, what's going to give me the courage to come forward when my entire gender has already said that this is okay?
Right.
So as men, we may have to make sure that we are defining assault for ourselves the same way we're defining it for women. If we're not, then we're creating a barrier for our counterpart who wants to come forward when something we've already approved as a gender happens to him.
Right. No, understood. Great points. Great points, Edward. So I asked every one of my guests this last question. So if you could have the audience, if you could have coffee with or have a meeting with one person that you think could move our movement forward, who would that be and why?
Perpetrator. It would be a perpetrator. Like I would love to talk to a racist, and I bet if I listen to some of the reasons why that person's racist, I might understand. Like, okay, you know what? You have a great point. You just have a misunderstanding of that, and that kind of conversation brings understanding. There's a guy in DM10 Strong named Dom. Dom was a domestic violence abuser. He used to abuse his spouse. He has reformed from that, and now he gives talks talking about this is why I was so successful. So if you don't want another person to be successful, this is what you do. So if I could talk to a perpetrator and figure out what was the mentality? How did you get past it if you got past it? What could society do to protect themselves from people who were like you, right? So I would absolutely talk to a perpetrator.
Great. So is there anything you want to share with our audience that you're working on now?
That I'm working on?
Any new, are you working on anything as far as new books or new projects that you'd like to share with us and you want us to know about?
Well, I am. I have an album that just came out. It's on all the streaming sites, Spotify, Apple Music. It's called Unstable Man. And I'm working on a series called the Brain Dump Series, which is pretty much a collection of poems that I've written years ago and never had an outlet to express them. So I'm creating a video, episodic video thing called the Brain Dump Series. The first episode is already on YouTube. If you search Obbie West, as it pertains to advocacy, it's ongoing. I'm just being vigilant, seeing what's going on, trying to create presentations that are going to address whatever seems to be the relevant problem in society right now, and trying to push forward as best as possible to bring awareness to this issue so that we can try to combat the continuance of it.
Well, I mean, I just think what you're doing is just super powerful. I think it, we have to find ways to get to everyone. And I think, I'm going to reach a certain person and you're going to reach a completely different person. And we may have some crossover, but we need everybody. We need to reach everybody, man. And I'm just really super proud of the work you're doing and appreciative that you took your time today with us. I think this is a real treat for our viewers and our listeners. So I wish you all the best of luck. I hope our paths cross multiple times I
Absolutely.
can't wait till we start partnering on, on some powerful work, because I think eventually that's where we're going to be. And we're going to be doing some pretty awesome stuff. So thank you again. Wish you the best of luck on everything that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And same to you. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Collectively, we'll get it figured out.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone. You've been watching Disrupting the Dominoes. And, let's put a halt on those dominoes from falling and disrupt the dominoes of violence. Thank you.